following video deals with mature subject matter, which may not be suitable for younger children. Viewer discretion is advised.
Before we get into the video, take a look at these t-shirts. For the gentlemen, there's Papa Squatch. For the ladies, there's Mama Squatch. And for the kids, there's Sasquatch in training. For a limited time, these shirts will be available only on mysteriesofcanada.com for $29 Canadian, or about $21 US. To get a closer look at this rare and elusive apparel, and support this channel in the process, please check out the link in the description. On the morning of February 19th, 2013, multiple guests of a Stay on Main hotel in downtown Los Angeles complained that their showers were not working. Instead of delivering the hot, clear water they were accustomed to, the nozzles spurted a dark, noxious liquid that had a funny taste. A maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez was tasked with fixing the problem. Since all the water in the hotel derived from 4 cisterns which were kept on the roof, the worker suspected that the issue lay therein and climbed onto the roof to investigate. The Stay on Main was a budget establishment, formerly known as the Cecil Hotel, a name already infamous in the City of Angels. Since 1927, 3 years after its grand opening, the Cecil had been the site of an alarming number of murders, suicides, and unexplained deaths, some of them unusually grotesque in their nature. It had housed 2 prolific serial killers in the midst of their sprees: the dreaded Night Stalker Richard Ramirez, terror of the San Gabriel Valley, and Jack Unterweger, an Austrian convicted of murder in 4 countries. Some said that the hotel was permeated by a sinister atmosphere, perhaps the psychic accumulation of all the suffering and despair that had been experienced there, or the energetic discharge of the dark spirits which such an establishment would undoubtedly attract. The Cecil Hotel had acquired such an unsavory reputation that some writers had nicknamed it Hotel Death. On that fateful Tuesday morning, in the winter of 2013, while Lopez was investigating the cause of the hotel's poor water quality, a search was ongoing for Elisa Lam, a guest of the Cecils who had gone missing 2 weeks earlier. The 21-year-old native of Vancouver, British Columbia, was on holiday when she suddenly vanished without a trace. Of all the tragic incidents to take place at the Cecil Hotel, her disappearance is perhaps the most disturbing. In late January 2013, Elisa had decided to take a hiatus from her studies at Vancouver's University of British Columbia and treat herself to a grand tour of America's West Coast, an adventure she inaugurated with a going-away party to which she invited her family and friends. She had a close relationship with her parents and phoned them every day during her vacation to assure them of her safety and well-being. Traveling solo by rail and bus, she made her way from Vancouver to San Diego, California, where she visited the world-famous San Diego Zoo. Finally, she arrived in LA. On January 28th, Elisa checked into the Cecil Hotel and booked a room for 3 nights. 3 days later, on the eve of her scheduled departure, she disappeared. When her parents failed to receive a phone call from her that day, they notified the Los Angeles Police Department, as did the Stay at Main Hotel when she failed to check out. Throughout the first 2 weeks of February, the LAPD conducted a search for the missing Canadian, which was supplemented by the efforts of her parents, who had flown out from Vancouver to assist the operation. Officers swept the roof and the hotel floors, but failed to find any trace of the missing woman. A canine team was brought in, but the dogs were unable to track her scent. It seemed as though Elisa Lam had vanished into thin air. On February 13th, 2 weeks after Elisa's disappearance, the LAPD released surveillance footage captured by a CCTV camera in one of the hotel's elevators. This disturbing video was taken at the inauspicious hour of 3 o'clock in the morning on the very day of Elisa's vanishing. The video begins with the elevator door opening to admit Elisa, who immediately pushes the buttons to every floor before standing in a corner expectantly, as if waiting for someone. Several moments later, the young Canadian creeps towards the elevator entrance, then quickly scans the hallway outside, before withdrawing just as hastily. The next minute of footage consists of the young woman furtively peering down the hallways from various concealed positions, cautiously exiting and entering the lift, and pressing all the elevator buttons a second time, her behavior lending the impression that she is hiding from someone, or something. Near the end of the video, in what is perhaps the eeriest segment of the footage, Elisa moves her hands in an uncanny manner, first in a slow wave-like motion, as if attempting to touch something that she cannot see, and then as if to perform some inscrutable manual operation, or as some have suggested, as if in conversation with some invisible interlocutor. That accomplished, she walks away from the elevator, the doors of which immediately close for the first time in the video. 6 days after the release of the footage, hotel guests began to complain of the water quality in their rooms, prompting the aforementioned Santiago Lopez to investigate. The handyman climbed onto the hotel roof and opened the hatch to one of the 4 water tanks that were kept there, suspecting that the culprit lay inside. Down below, in a well of murky water, floated the naked, decomposing corpse of Elisa Lam. The official police investigation into Elisa's death concluded that the Canadian had suffered a psychotic break on the night of January 31st, 2013, and had climbed into the water tank of her own volition, perhaps in an irrational attempt to escape some imaginary pursuer. Back in Canada, she had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and clinical depression, and had a history of hallucinating when she did not take her prescribed pharmaceuticals. Investigators believe that she had neglected to take her medication in Los Angeles, and developed paranoia in consequence. Her resultant delusions drove her to the roof of the hotel and into the cistern, from which she found herself unable to escape. In an effort to stay afloat, she had removed her waterlogged clothing, which accounted for the nude condition in which she was found. When she became too exhausted to tread water any longer, Elisa slipped beneath the surface and drowned. Despite this prosaic explanation for the death of Elisa Lam, internet sleuths have put forth other, more sinister theories, which they claim address important questions that the police report failed to answer. Some have proposed that the young woman, in her vulnerable mental state, was lured to her death by the malicious influence of the dark supernatural entities believed to haunt the Cecil. To support their hypotheses, these theorists have cited eerie anomalies, like the inexplicable behavior of the elevator, or the time at which the footage was captured, the latter being known in various folk traditions as the witching hour or the devil's hour. Some have read meaning into the strange hand gestures that Elisa made on the night of her disappearance. Others have observed uncanny similarities between the events of her death and both the plot of the 2005 film Dark Water and a Korean urban legend known as the Elevator Game. Others still believe that she was murdered by an especially wily killer who managed to avoid detection on camera, noting the difficulty she would have had in closing the water tank hatch behind her, and observing that the footage released by the police appears to be tampered with and missing time. For many, the mysterious death of Elisa Lam remains unsolved. On the evening of July 30th, 2008, at around 7 o'clock, passengers of Greyhound Canada bus 1170 shuffled back to their seats after a scheduled rest stop in the community of Erickson, Manitoba. They had been traveling for about 12 hours since their early morning departure in Edmonton, Alberta, and were anxious to complete the last leg of their long journey to Winnipeg, Manitoba, blissfully unaware that they were about to witness what has been described as one of the most horrific murders in Canadian history. At that tiny rural hamlet, at the edge of Manitoba's forested parkland region, a new passenger got on the bus, a middle-aged Chinese immigrant named Vince Lee. A resident of Edmonton, Lee had traveled to Erickson on a different Greyhound bus the day before, and had spent the night on a wooden bench beside the local co-op grocery store. He was a tall man with a shaved head and dark sunglasses, who attracted little attention from his fellow passengers. He took a seat at the front of the bus, where he sat calmly and quietly, his hands resting on a backpack that he kept in front of him. The bus made another pit stop at the city of Brandon, Manitoba, where Lee left to smoke a cigarette, engaging in casual small talk with another passenger. When he got back on the bus, he decided to switch seats. He walked slowly down the aisle, looking at every passenger that he passed. At the back of the bus, his gaze fell on Tim McLean, a slight, wiry carnival worker who was returning home to Winnipeg after a gig in Edmonton. Tim, who was described by his friends and family as a genial, outgoing character, gave Lee a friendly nod before putting on his headphones and leaning his head against the window for a bit of shut-eye. Lee took a seat beside him and withdrew a 2-liter bottle of iced tea and a roll of toilet paper from his backpack, tucking the latter under his chin as he took a sip. This unusual action piqued the curiosity of Stephen Ellison, an 18-year-old college student from the Northwest Territories, who sat in the seat opposite Lee with his wife Isabel. Stephen decided to keep an eye on the stranger, unnerved by his unsettling behavior. The sun was low in the prairie sky when bus driver Bruce Martin decided to shut off the overhead lights and turn on a movie for the passengers, pitching the bus interior into relative darkness. At a site about 15 minutes west of the city of Portage-la-Prairie, Vince Lee began to rock back and forth in his seat, quietly chanting something in Chinese. All the while, McLean continued to doze with his headphones on, oblivious to his seatmates' alarming antics. Then, to the growing horror of Stephen Ellison, who peered at him through the gloom, the immigrant withdrew an enormous hunting knife from his backpack. Before the student had a chance to sound the alarm, Vincent Lee calmly stood up and plunged the knife into the neck of sleeping Tim McLean. All of a sudden, I heard a guy screaming, recalled Garnet Caden, a 26-year-old former combat engineer who occupied the seat in front of Lee and McLean, who was reading a book at the time of the incident. It was a blood-curdling scream, he said, like something between a dog howling and a baby crying, I guess you could say. The involuntary shriek issued from the throat of Tim McLean, jolted wide awake by the shock of the blade. Caden whirled around to see Lee repeatedly and methodically stabbing McLean in the neck with what he described as a big Rambo knife, referring to the formidable Bowie-style survival knife which appears in the Rambo action films. In retrospect, Caden was struck by the coolness with which Lee performed the savage act, describing his demeanor as calm and his movements as robotic. With blood gushing from the cavity in his neck, Tim McLean jumped over his attacker and collapsed in the aisle, where Lee continued his relentless assault, slamming his knife over and over into the 22-year-old's limp form. Alerted by Stephen Ellison, who had rushed to the front of the bus, driver Bruce Martin slammed on the brakes and ushered his panicked passengers out of the vehicle. A truck driver named Chris Alguire, who had been traveling behind bus 1170, recognized that something was amiss and pulled over to the side of the highway to see if he could be of assistance, as did Bernie Syrup, another Canadian Greyhound driver who resolved to investigate the commotion. In a later interview, Garnet Caden described how he, Syrup, and Alguire armed themselves with a crowbar, a hammer, and a metal pipe, and re-entered the bus in the hope of saving McLean's life. To their horror, the three men found Lee kneeling over the young man's body in the process of sawing off his head. Although Lee had been fully absorbed in his grisly task from the moment he first sank his knife into his unsuspecting victim, apparently heedless of the frantic screams of his fellow passengers and Martin's entreaties for him to stop, he seemed startled by the arrival of these new armed observers. Tearing his eyes off his prey, Lee glared up at the three men and lunged at them with his knife, chasing them off the bus. Syrup managed to slam the vehicle's doors on Lee's knife-wielding arm just in time, effectively locking him inside. The killer made several wild slashes at the three men before withdrawing his arm and returning his attention to McLean's body. Outside, on a lonely shoulder of the Trans-Canada Highway, the Greyhound's 36 passengers milled about in a panic, some having fainted and others falling violently ill. Caden, Syrup, and Alguire, meanwhile, continued to guard the door. In the midst of the tumult, Lee approached the door again and, without exhibiting any hint of emotion, held up McLean's severed head for the view of his captive audience. Then, gripping his gory knife with one hand and holding up his grim prize aloft in the other, he paraded up and down the aisle, as if displaying a trophy. By the time the RCMP arrived on the scene, Lee had eviscerated McLean's headless corpse and was in the process of distributing his various organs to different corners of the bus. Rather than put an end to the desecration, the Mounties established a perimeter around the vehicle and waited for the suspect to exit. Officers watched in horror as Lee devoured McLean's eyes and a third of his heart. When they attempted to communicate with him, Lee's only response was, "I have to stay on this bus forever." At 1:30 a.m., after a 4-hour standoff, Lee smashed a window at the back of the bus and attempted to escape. Mounties took the opportunity to tase and arrest him. In his pockets, they found McLean's ears, nose, and tongue. Before his subsequent trial, Lee underwent a psychological evaluation, which determined that he suffered from undiagnosed schizophrenia and had murdered, mutilated, and cannibalized Tim McLean under the influence of a psychotic delusion. "I am the evil son of an evil god," he told court psychiatrist Dr. Stanley Yaren, explaining that he had been commanded to kill McLean by a voice in his head, which he presumed to be of divine origin. For some time, this voice had prepared him for an encounter with an evil force that he would be required to slay, for which purpose he had purchased a hunting knife from the department store Canadian Tire. During the bus ride to Winnipeg, the voice informed him that the evil force he was required to destroy was Tim McLean. After he had killed the young man, the voice instructed Lee to mutilate and scatter his body so that it could not reassemble, come back to life, and kill him. Failure to do so, Lee was told, would be fatal to him and the rest of humanity. In spite of undeniable evidence to the contrary, Lee vehemently denied eating any part of his victim, apparently having no memory of this most gruesome act of his ghastly performance. Although Lee cannot shed any light on the motive which compelled him to commit this heinous act, modern psychology may have an answer, which echoes the killer's self-professed reason for mutilating McLean's corpse. According to psychologist Dr. Sophie Raymond and colleagues, in their 2019 paper for the Journal of Forensic Sciences, for a small number of schizophrenic killers, cannibalism is a self-defense reaction to a perceived threat of destruction. Survival depends on the annihilation or assimilation of the other. To those familiar with Manitoban folklore and the history of the region in which Lee committed his appalling deed, the killing of Tim McLean evokes disturbing parallels with the legend of the Wendigo, an evil spirit which the local Cree, Ojibwe, and Métis traditionally believe haunts their ancestral land. This spirit is said to infiltrate the psyches of its victims and instill in them an irresistible compulsion to consume human flesh. Throughout recorded history, native men and women, supposedly possessed by this malicious boreal demon, killed and ate their friends and family in bizarre killing sprees, the last reported incident having occurred in 1878. Perhaps Vince Lee's hideous actions on July 30th, 2008 were simply the products of mental illness. Or perhaps the Wendigo has returned to the northern plains. In addition to their struggles with mental illness, Elisa Lam and Vince Lee have something in common, namely their membership in Canada's oldest and largest Asian subculture. From their participation in the gold rushes of the 19th century, to their essential role in the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, Canada's Chinese community has had a major hand in the formation of the western provinces, particularly British Columbia. Entwined with their arduous history is a web of mystery, hidden away in newspaper archives and dusty history books. In this piece, we will travel back in time, digging up forgotten Chinese mysteries from Canada. In the next segment of the 6-part series, we will dig up a disturbing legend regarding the fate of Chinese settlers shipped to Vancouver Island in the 1780s.